There is a passage in Genesis chapter 6 that spans only 4 verses. It consists of 94 words in the original Hebrew, yet these 94 words have sparked a debate that has endured for 3 millennia and remains unresolved. This passage mentions the Nephilim, the sons of God who took the daughters of men, and a generation of Gibborim, mighty warriors resulting from this union. The text does not clarify who these sons of God were. It does not detail the nature of the Nephilim. It does not explain why this led to the flood. It merely records the fact and moves on, as if the original reader already knew what was at stake. The issue is that we, 3,000 years later, do not know. And when you lay this text alongside the Sumerian records about the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to work on earth, the coincidence becomes unsettling. Because we are talking about 2 cultures, 2 languages, 2 geographies, narrating structurally similar events, using vocabulary that overlaps at points too significant to ignore. If you are looking for investigations that connect ancient text, archaeology, and competing hypotheses without selling easy certainties, subscribe now. It's not about believing or disbelieving. It's about following the chain of evidence as far as it truly goes. And the comments section of this channel is the right place to engage in reasoned disagreement. Now, let's get to the point. Today, you will understand 3 things. First, what the term Nephilim really means in biblical Hebrew and why each translation tells a different story. Second, what Sumerian texts say about the Anunnaki and whether there is textual basis to connect them to the Nephilim, beyond mere speculation. Third, what archaeological and linguistic evidence supports or undermines this connection hypothesis. By the end, you won't have a definitive answer because it doesn't exist. But you will have something better, the right questions and a map of where each interpretation stands or crumbles. Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. Let's go to the text. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The first technical question is, what does Nephilim mean? The Hebrew root naphal means to fall. The grammatical construction, however, is ambiguous. Nephilim can be read as the fallen, those who have fallen in a passive translation, or it can be read as the ones who make fall, those who bring down in an active translation. The Septuagint, the Greek translation from the 3rd century BCE, rendered it as giants. The Latin Vulgate followed the same path. But giants is not present in the Hebrew. What is present is Nephilim, a term that appears only once more in the Bible in Numbers 13, where the spies sent to Canaan report having seen Nephilim and feeling like grasshoppers in their sight. This suggests stature, but does not prove the word means giant by definition. It may refer to formidable warriors, a dominant lineage, or literally beings of another ontological status. Now, the sons of God. The Hebrew term is Bene Elohim. Elohim is translated as God, but it is a plural noun. In poetic contexts, it can mean divine beings, members of the celestial assembly, messengers, or even human judges endowed with divine authority. Job clearly uses Bene Elohim to refer to celestial beings. The Psalms also do so. Yet Genesis 6 lacks explicit angelic context. It simply states that the sons of God saw, desired, and took. The verb took is lakach, which can be neutral, but in other contexts carries the weight of conquest, appropriation. And verse 3 introduces divine punishment, the limit of 120 years. If everything were merely a moral allegory about mixed marriage, why would God's response be to limit human lifespan? And why would this immediately precede the narrative of the flood? Here lies the first structural contradiction. If the Nephilim were just large men or powerful warriors resulted from ordinary human marriages, why does the text distinguish them as a separate category? Why mention the sons of God as agents of this union if the message were solely about human violence? And if they were metaphor for tyranny or social injustice, why does Numbers 13 repeat the term Nephilim as if it were a recognizable ethnicity with specific physical characteristics? The allegorical explanation resolves the theological problem but creates narrative gaps. The literal explanation creates another issue. Can celestial beings biologically interbreed with humans? And if they can, what does this imply about the nature of the pre-flood world? Now, shift continents and go back about 1,000 years before Genesis was written in the form we know. You are in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Cuneiform writing has existed for over 1,000 years. The Sumerian city-states are at their peak, and religious texts describe the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki is composite. Anu is the god of the sky, the supreme deity. Ki is earth. Anunnaki, therefore, are something like those from the sky to the earth, or descendants of Anu associated with the earth. Sumerian texts are unambiguous about their role. The Anunnaki descended, organized labor, created systems, governed cities, took humans as servants, crossed with humans in some accounts, and were involved in the decision to send the flood. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, the Anunnaki appear as judges and executors of the orders of the great gods. In Atrahasis, another Mesopotamian epic, the Anunnaki are explicitly dissatisfied with heavy labor and demand that humans be created to take over the workload. The creation of man, in this context, is functional, not theological, not moral, it is logistical. The lesser gods rebelled, the greater gods needed labor, and the solution was to mix clay with divine blood to create a hybrid worker. The text describes Enlil, one of the primary Anunnaki, as the one who eventually decides to exterminate humanity due to excessive noise, not due to sin, due to volume. And Enki, another Anunnaki, saves Atrahasis, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Noah, instructing him to build a boat. So you have two narratives, one Hebrew, one Sumerian. In the Hebrew account, beings called the sons of God interbreed with humans, generate Nephilim, violence spreads, and God decides to flood the earth. In the Sumerian account, beings called the Anunnaki descend, organize human labor. Some texts mention interbreeding. Humanity multiplies and disturbs, and the gods decide to flood the earth. The structures rhyme. Now, the question is not whether this proves that Nephilim and Anunnaki are the same. The question is, why do two cultures, separated by language and theology, tell such closely related versions of a cataclysmic event, preceded by troublesome divine-human interaction? There are three possible answers. The first is cultural contamination. Abraham came from Ur, a Sumerian city. The Hebrews were captives in Babylon, intense cultural contact for centuries. Thus, the Hebrew scribes absorbed Mesopotamian myths and rewrote them with a monotheistic framing. This is called the literary dependency theory and is the standard academic explanation. The second answer is common historical memory. Both peoples descend from populations that witnessed real events in the post-glacial period, perhaps massive floods, perhaps contact with a technologically advanced civilization that disappeared, and the stories, though distorted, preserve a factual core. The third answer is thematic coincidence. All ancient cultures had myths of gods descending, giants, floods, because they are universal human archetypes. The human brain generates these stories independently. Each of these answers has problems. Cultural contamination is strong, but does not explain why the Hebrew vocabulary in Genesis 6 is so ancient, and why the passage feels out of context within the larger text, as if it were a preserved fragment of something older. Common historical memory is appealing, but it requires archaeological evidence of a lost civilization or global catastrophic event on the right timeline, and that is debatable. Thematic coincidence is safe, but does not explain the specificity of the similarities. We are not talking about a generic flood. We are talking about a flood preceded by divine-human crossover, followed by a survivor, instructed by a dissenting deity using specific nautical technology. Let's delve further into the term Anunnaki. In the Sumerian religious system, the cosmology is hierarchical. At the top, Anu, the sky. After him, Enlil, lord of the wind and dry land. Then, Enki, lord of the subterranean freshwater and wisdom. Below them are the Anunnaki, who are described as judges of the underworld in some texts and as administrators of the earth in others. Below the Anunnaki are the Igigi, who, in the earliest texts, are the gods who do the heavy lifting. In the Atrahasis, the Igigi revolt against the Anunnaki, and this revolt requires the creation of humans. Thus, the Anunnaki are not the direct creators. They are supervisors. But in later texts, the distinction between Igigi and Anunnaki dissolves, and Anunnaki becomes an umbrella term for the divine class linked to the earth. Now compare with later Jewish angelic structure. In the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text written around the 3rd century BCE, the Watchers are angels sent to observe humanity. 200 of them, led by Azazel and Shemihaza, decide to descend to Mount Hermon and take human wives. From this union, the Nephilim are born, described as giants 3,000 cubits tall. The Nephilim consume all human produce, then begin to devour animals. Then they start consuming humans. Then they begin to devour each other. The resulting chaos forces God to send the flood. After the flood, the spirits of the dead Nephilim become demons that roam the earth. Enoch is explicit. It is not an allegory. It is a cosmological narrative about the origin of evil, of violence, and the necessity of the flood. Enoch is not canonical Bible for Jews and most Christians, but was widely read in the Second Temple period. Fragments were found in Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament cites Enoch directly. So the interpretative tradition that reads Genesis 6 literally, with falling angels crossing and generating giants, is not a modern invention. It is the dominant reading in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. Origen, in the 3rd century, still debated whether angels could have bodies. Augustine, in the 5th century, rejected the literal interpretation and proposed that the sons of God were the lineage of Seth, the righteous, and the daughters of men were the lineage of Cain, the wicked. This allegorical interpretation became orthodox in Western Christianity, but it was not the original. So we have two interpretive layers, one ancient, literal, connecting Genesis 6 with a fall of angels and hybridization. Another later, allegorical, reading as moral metaphor. And we have Sumerian texts that describe exactly the type of event that the literal interpretation proposes: gods descending, organizing, interbreeding, and then destroying. The question now is there anything in the archaeological record that supports either of these readings? Or are we just stacking texts with no physical grounding? Uruk, 3rd millennium BCE, the largest city in the world at the time with about 50,000 inhabitants. Cyclopean walls. The ziggurat of Anu, a stepped structure dedicated to the god of heaven with a base of about 70 square meters. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Uruk, repeatedly mentions the Anunnaki as judges and advisors. Gilgamesh, the king, is described as 2/3 god, 1/3 human. This implies hybridization. His friend Enkidu is created by the gods from clay. The narrative is functional, not mystical. The gods need a rival for Gilgamesh, so they fabricate one. Gilgamesh seeks immortality, finds Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, who tells the same story as Atrahasis. The gods decided to flood, Enki warned him. He built a boat, saved his family and the animals, and the gods repented after the flood. The architectural structure of Uruk reflects organization that requires planning, logistics, hierarchy. The foundations of the temples are precise. The irrigation channels work on a large scale. Cuneiform writing emerges in Uruk to manage stocks, taxes, ownership. It is not poetry, it is bureaucracy. And the administrative texts mention the Anunnaki as authority, not as an abstract concept, as entities that receive offerings, possess temples, and have dedicated priests. If the Anunnaki were merely a metaphor for natural forces, why would the accounting treat them as concrete agents? Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer according to Sumerian tradition. The Temple of Enki was rebuilt several times on the same site over millennia. Excavations reveal layers of foundations that date back to the 5th millennium BCE, before writing, before urbanization. What existed in Eridu that justified such long continuity? The texts say that Eridu was where royalty first descended from heaven. They did not emerge from the earth. They descended. And Enki, the god associated with Eridu, is described as the one who organized labor, taught agriculture, founded cities, and established laws. In Atrahasis, Enki is the one who saves humanity against Enlil's will. He is the dissident. If you try to fit this into the Genesis narrative, Enki acts like the serpent in Eden, the one who gives forbidden knowledge, who challenges the superior authority, who preserves humanity despite the decree of punishment. Enlil functions as the god of the flood, authoritarian, punitive, determined to destroy. Enki and Enlil are in constant conflict in Sumerian texts. God and the serpent are in conflict in Genesis. The structure is mirrored, but Genesis is monotheistic. There is no divine council disputing. There's a sovereign God and a rebellious creation. So either Genesis simplified an earlier polytheistic narrative, or the Sumerian narratives preserved a distorted memory of something that Genesis records with greater theological precision. Archaeology does not prove theology, but archaeology can show that the ancient narratives describe real places, plausible events, feasible technology, and Sumerian texts describe an abrupt transition. Before, villages. After, cities. Before, simple pottery. After, bronze, writing, mathematics, astronomy. This transition is called the Urban Revolution, and it occurred in less than 1,000 years. Too fast for isolated cultural evolution, according to some. Exactly what is expected from gradual accumulation, according to others. But the Sumerian narrative does not describe gradual accumulation. It describes intervention. The Anunnaki descended, taught, organized, and then the flood restarted the process. Chronology matters. Genesis was compiled in its current form between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, but the events described are situated much earlier. The genealogical list of Genesis 5 places the flood about 1,500 years after Adam, and Adam is situated at creation. If you follow the literal chronology, the flood happened around 2,300 BCE, but archaeology places the peak of Sumerian civilization between 3,000 and 2,000 BCE. There is no evidence of a global flood during that period. There is evidence of massive regional floods in Mesopotamia, especially between 3000 and 2800 BCE. So either the biblical chronology is compressed, or the flood was regional and amplified in memory, or we are reading allegorically something that the writers intended literally. Now, back to the term Gibborim. Genesis 6, verse 4, states that the Nephilim generated Gibborim, men of renown. Gibborim comes from Gibbor, which means powerful, warrior, hero. It is the same term used to describe Nimrod in Genesis 10, where he is called Gibbor hunter before the Lord, and founder of the first cities post-flood, including Babel, Erech, which is Uruk, and Akkad. Nimrod is described as a descendant of Cush, son of Ham, son of Noah. Rather, the narrative suggests that Nimrod restarted something. He did not just build, he rebuilt. And the Tower of Babel, which he leads, is an attempt to reach the heavens and make a name. The vocabulary is the same as in Genesis 6, men of renown. Making a name, reaching the heavens. The implication is that the pre-flood rebellion continued post-flood. In Sumerian texts, the post-flood period also restarts kingship. The Sumerian royal list divides history into two sections, before the flood and after the flood. Before, kings ruled for absurd periods, tens of thousands of years. After, the reigns are shorter but still supernatural, hundreds of years. Gilgamesh, for instance, ruled for 126 years according to the list. Compare this with Genesis 6, verse 3, where God limits human life to 120 years. It is the same number. Coincidence? Or shared memory of a real change in human longevity after a catastrophic event? The standard academic explanation is that symbolic numbers were common. 120 is 12 times 10, and 12 is a number of completeness. It does not have to be literal. But if it is not literal, why would the Sumerian royal list, written by scribes who administered actual empires, use symbolic numbers in administrative documents? The list is not poetry. It is official genealogy. And the transition between absurdly long reigns and possible reigns occurs exactly at the flood point. Something changed. The texts say it changed. Archaeology shows climate change and settlement collapse during this period. The concordance is uncomfortable. Let's go to the Book of Enoch. The complete narrative of the Watchers is found in the first 36 chapters. 200 angels descend upon Mount Hermon. They make a pact among themselves because they know they are violating an order. Each chooses a woman. The women become pregnant. The children grow to 3,000 cubits in height. 3,000 cubits equals about 1,300 meters. This is clearly hyperbolic, but the point is not the exact measurement. The point is that they were uncontrollable. The Nephilim consume the entire agricultural production. Then they begin to eat animals. Afterward, they start consuming humans. Finally, they begin to eat each other. And the Watchers teach humans forbidden knowledge. Azazel teaches metallurgy, weapons making, cosmetics. Shemihaza teaches sorcery, roots, medicinal plants. Others teach astrology, divination, signs of the moon, signs of the sun. Compare this with Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki. Enki teaches agriculture, construction, writing, mathematics, and medicine. It is not described as forbidden. It is described as civilization, but the structure is the same. Outsiders transfer knowledge. Humans acquire technology. The outcome is rapid urbanization, hierarchy, war, oppression, and eventually divine punishment via flood. The difference is the moral evaluation. For the Sumerians, knowledge was good and the flood was divine excess. For the Jews, knowledge was transgression and the flood was a necessary justice. But the basic scheme is identical. The text of Enoch specifically mentions that the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon. Hermon is located on the border between Lebanon and Syria, at the northern extreme of ancient Israel. It is a significant mountain with peaks above 2,800 meters. In the Hellenistic period, there was a temple dedicated to Baal Hermon at the summit. In the Roman period, temples to Pan. The region was seen as a portal between worlds, a place where the divine touched the earthly. Why does Enoch specify Hermon? If the story were merely a parable, there would be no need for geography. But Hermon is named, and Hermon is on the route between Mesopotamia and Canaan. If there was cultural contact, Hermon would be the natural corridor. Deuteronomy 3 mentions Og, king of Bashan, described as the last of the Rephaim. Rephaim is another Hebrew term for giants, related but distinct from Nephilim. Og had an iron bed measuring 9 cubits by 4 cubits, about 4 meters by 1 meter 80. The text states that the bed could still be seen in Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, as physical evidence. 9 cubits are not 1,300 meters. They are 4 meters. Excessive for a human, but not impossible for an individual with pathological gigantism. But the text does not present Og as an anomaly. He is presented as a representative of a lineage, the Rephaim, who inhabited the region before the Israelite conquest. Numbers 13 repeats this. The spies return from Canaan and report, "We saw the Nephilim, the children of Anak, who are part of the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in their sight. Anak is the ancestor of the Anakim, a people inhabiting Hebron. Joshua 15 and Judges 1 mention Caleb driving out the 3 sons of Anak from Hebron. Thus, the post-flood Nephilim are not abstraction. They are identified with specific ethnic groups, militarily controllable, but described as physically intimidating. And their memory persists for centuries in Israelite tradition. Do you read this as metaphor, historical memory, a mixture of the two, or something else? What convinces you when you see texts from different cultures, telling structurally identical versions but with inverted moral evaluations? Leave it in the comments. Now, let's address counter-arguments. The standard academic position is literary dependency. The Hebrews absorbed Mesopotamian myths during the Babylonian exile between 586 and 538 BCE, or earlier, during contact with the Assyrians, in the 8th and 7th centuries. The Hebrew scribes took the narrative from Atrahasis, the structure of Enuma Elish, and rewrote them with a monotheistic framing. This would explain the similarities without needing to propose shared real events. It is a clean explanation, based on documented cultural diffusion, and doesn't require speculation about lost civilizations or advanced technology. But this explanation has weak points. First, Genesis 6 uses archaic vocabulary. The construction of Bene Elohim, sons of God, is rare and ancient. It appears in Job, also considered an ancient text, but does not appear in post-exilic texts. If Genesis 6 was written or edited during the exile, why would it use obsolete language? Second, the text is too short, 4 verses. If it were a late insertion to harmonize with Babylonian myths, it would be more elaborate, would explain better, and would clearly connect with the flood. But Genesis 6 seems like a fragment, a preserved memory without complete context. Third, the Book of Enoch, which expands the narrative, dates from at least the 3rd century BCE, but its traditions are considered older, possibly pre-exilic. And Enoch does not show direct Babylonian influence. It shows influence from native Israelite traditions. Thus, literary dependency resolves part of the problem, but does not solve it completely. There exists another layer. The Mesopotamian texts that discuss the Anunnaki are not from the exile period. They are much older. Atrahasis dates from the 18th century BCE. Enuma Elish from the 12th century. The Epic of Gilgamesh, 3rd millennium in early forms, standardized in the 12th century. These texts were already ancient when the Hebrews encountered Babylon. So, if there was absorption, it was not from contemporary myths. It was from traditions that had 1,000 years when Abraham left Ur and 2,000 years when the Jews went into exile. This opens another possibility: deep historical memory. Both peoples, Hebrews and Sumerians, descend from populations in the Fertile Crescent that experienced the Neolithic transition, urbanization, and dramatic climate changes at the end of the Ice Age. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, sea levels rose over 100 meters. Coastal valleys were flooded. The Persian Gulf expanded. The Black Sea possibly flooded catastrophically when the Bosporus broke. Entire populations were displaced, sunken cities, refugees migrating inland. If these populations had oral narratives about the period before the flood, these narratives would have survived for millennia, retold, distorted, but preserving a core. There was a time before the flood when things were different, and something caused the flood. Underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf has found evidence of submerged coastal settlements dating between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. Not cities, villages, but continuous human occupation in areas that today are under 40 meters of water. If these populations had some level of organization, some initial technology, and were swept away by rapid flooding, the traumatic memory would have been passed down, and when writing emerged 3,000 years later, this memory would have been recorded. But 3,000 years of oral transmission distort everything. So what we know is that Sumerian and Hebrew texts agree that a flood occurred, that it was preceded by some kind of transgression involving the divine and the human, and that only a few survived. Now, the most speculative hypothesis: the Anunnaki and the Nephilim were real, in the sense that they were a population with advanced technology, possibly remnants of a pre-flood civilization that interacted with less developed Neolithic populations. These interactions were interpreted as divine because the technological difference was incomprehensible. Over time, this advanced population disappeared, either from a natural disaster or internal collapse, but their memory persisted as gods or fallen angels. This hypothesis is popular in alternative circles, but it faces serious problems. Where is the physical evidence for this advanced technology? Where are the tools, structures, biological remains? The standard response is that everything was destroyed by the flood or buried under meters of sediment. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and it is not evidence of presence either. It is a gap. The issue with the lost civilization hypothesis is that it needs to explain not only the textual narrative but also the logistics. If the Anunnaki had the technology to build cities like Uruk, why would they leave so little trace? If they were biologically compatible for crossbreeding with humans, they were advanced humans, not extraterrestrials. And if they were advanced humans, where did they come from? The only plausible window is between 15,000 and 10,000 BCE, when the climate was changing. Populations were reorganizing, and there are gaps in the archaeological record. But filling gaps with speculation is not a method. It is fantasy. So, back to the text. What does Genesis 6 really allow us to affirm? First, that there existed an ancient belief that beings called the sons of God crossed with humans. Second, that this union resulted in a generation identified as Nephilim and Gibram. Third, that this was followed by the flood. The text does not explain the ontological nature of the sons of God. It does not detail the biology of the Nephilim. It does not specify whether the flood was global or regional. It only records the sequence. And this sequence is preserved with archaic vocabulary, which suggests it is very old, possibly from pre-literate oral tradition. What do Sumerian texts allow us to affirm? First, that the Anunnaki were described as beings from the sky who organized the earth. Second, that they interacted with humans, created humans, or taught humans, depending on the text. Third, that there was conflict among the Anunnaki themselves regarding humanity's fate. Fourth, that the flood was a divine decision executed by Enlil, but sabotaged by Enki, who saved Atrahasis. The Sumerian texts are more detailed than Genesis 6, but they are also polytheistic, functional, and devoid of the moral burden that Genesis carries. The connection between Nephilim and Anunnaki, then, relies on three pillars. Structural. Both narratives follow the same sequence of events. Linguistic. Both terms suggest beings coming from above or fallen from above. Geographical. Both traditions emerge from the Fertile Crescent with documented cultural contact. But a connection is not an identity. You can argue that the narratives derive from a common source without asserting that Nephilim and Anunnaki are literally the same beings. It may be that both preserve distorted memories of real events that neither describes accurately. And here comes the question of crossover. If the sons of God were angels, as Enoch proposes, then the crossover implies that angels can take on reproductive material form. This is a significant theological problem. Angels, in classic Jewish and Christian theology, are spirits. They do not have biology. Jesus says in Matthew 22 that the resurrected do not marry because they are like angels. Therefore, angels do not reproduce. But Genesis 6 and Enoch describe reproduction. The traditional solution is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were not angels, they were humans, the lineage of Seth, the righteous, who mixed with the lineage of Cain, the wicked. This resolves the theological problem but creates a textual issue. Why call humans sons of God? And why would the result be Nephilim, a unique term, if they were just large humans? The literal interpretation, therefore, requires accepting that angels, or whatever being the sons of God represent, may have reproductive material reality. And this implies that the boundary between spiritual and material is not as rigid as later theology defined it. The Sumerian texts do not have this problem. The Anunnaki are gods, but gods with bodies. They eat, drink, have sex, and have children. They are immortal, but not immaterial. Sumerian cosmology is more fluid. There is no absolute separation between the divine and the physical. So the narrative of crossover for the Sumerians requires no special explanation. It is what gods do. This suggests that the original source of the narrative, if a shared source exists, was closer to the Sumerian worldview than to the Hebrew, and that the Hebrew version, upon becoming monotheistic and moralized, lost clarity on the nature of the agents involved. Genesis 6 preserved the event, but did not preserve the ontology. Enoch attempted to recover the ontology, but within a Second Temple Jewish framework, thus adding angelology, demonology, and eschatological judgment. The Sumerian texts preserve both the event and the ontology, but within a polytheistic system that the Hebrews rejected. So what really happened? The honest answer is, we don't know. We know that two ancient traditions, each independently valuable, tell structurally similar stories. We know that these stories are anchored in real geography, disputed chronology, and vocabulary that suggests antiquity. We know that archaeology confirms massive regional floods, rapid urbanization, and intense cultural contact. But we do not know if the Nephilim and the Anunnaki refer to the same entities, or to distorted memories of different events, or to universal cultural archetypes that emerged independently. What we know is that the question is not closed, and that any honest answer needs to weigh text, archaeology, linguistics, and theology without favoring one over the others. Let's organize what we have. First, the textual evidence. Genesis 6 describes sons of God crossing with daughters of men, generating Nephilim, followed by the flood. Numbers 13 mentions Nephilim as a real people in Canaan, physically intimidating. Deuteronomy 3 mentions Og. king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim, with a bed 4 meters long. The Book of Enoch expands with 200 watchers descending on Mount Hermon, generating giants, teaching forbidden knowledge, causing chaos that forces the flood. Sumerian texts describe Anunnaki descending, organizing human labor, teaching civilization, with Enlil deciding to flood and Enki saving Atrahasis. The Epic of Gilgamesh repeats the structure, with Gilgamesh described as 2/3 god. The Sumerian royal list divides history into before and after the flood, with decreasing longevity. Second, the archaeological evidence. Uruk, 3rd millennium BCE, the largest city in the world. Cyclopean walls, ziggurats, writing, abrupt urban organization. Eridu, continuous occupation from the 5th millennium, Temple of Enki, rebuilt multiple times. Submerged settlements in the Persian Gulf, dated between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, inundated when sea levels rose. Evidence of massive regional floods in Mesopotamia between 3000 and 2800 BCE. No evidence of global flood. No physical evidence of anatomical giants beyond isolated cases of pathological gigantism. No structures that would require technology beyond what Neolithic and Bronze engineering could produce, though the speed of urban transition remains debated. Third, the linguistic evidence. Nephilim derives from Nephal, to fall, allowing reading as the fallen or the ones who make fall. Anunnaki derives from Anu plus ki, earth, meaning something like those from the sky to the earth. Both terms carry vertical sense, from above to below. Bene Elohim, sons of God, is an archaic construction, used in Job and Psalms for celestial beings. Giborim, the powerful, is a term applied to Nimrod and to the descendants of the Nephilim. The terminological overlap does not prove identity, but shows that both traditions use language of descent, verticality, and exceptional power to describe the agents of these narratives. Fourth, the chronology. Genesis compiles the narrative between 1000 and 500 years BCE, but the events are situated millennia earlier. Sumerian texts date from the 3rd millennium in oral forms, standardized in the 2nd millennium. The period of Hebrew-Mesopotamian cultural contact is intense in the 2nd millennium, when Abraham leaves Ur, and again in the 1st millennium, when Israel interacts with Assyria and Babylon. The Babylonian exile, 586 to 538 BCE, is the peak of cultural absorption. But the vocabulary of Genesis 6 is pre-exilic, suggesting that the tradition is older than the late contact. Now, the scenarios. Scenario A, direct literary dependency. Hebrew scribes, during or after the exile, took Mesopotamian narratives about Anunnaki and the flood and rewrote them with monotheistic framing. The Nephilim are the Hebrew version of the Anunnaki, not because they are the same beings, but because they are the same kind of narrative adapted to a different theology. Prose explains the structural similarities without needing to propose real events, is consistent with documented cultural diffusion, requires no speculation about lost civilizations. Cons, does not explain why Genesis 6 is so short and fragmented, does not explain the archaic vocabulary, fails to clarify why Enoch, pre-exilic, already had the complete narrative, and does not identify why the Mesopotamian texts were so old when contact occurred. Scenario B, common historical memory. Both traditions descend from populations in the Fertile Crescent that experienced the Neolithic transition, post-glacial floods, and rapid urbanization. These populations preserved oral memory of traumatic events, catastrophic regional floods, possibly contact with technologically distinct groups, and transmitted these memories over millennia. When writing arose, 3,000 years later, these memories were recorded, but 3,000 years of oral transmission distorted them. The Nephilim and the Anunnaki are not the same beings. They are distorted memories of something that happened, but which neither tradition describes accurately. Prose explains the similarities without direct dependence, is consistent with the archaeology of floods and urban transition, allows both traditions to have factual core. Cons requires acceptance that oral memory can preserve events for 3,000 to 5,000 years, which is debated, does not identify which real event is being remembered, and does not explain the specificity of the similarities, especially the divine-human crossover. Scenario C, partial identity with interpretive divergence. The Nephilim and Anunnaki refer to the same events or entities, but each culture interpreted them through its own lens. For the Sumerians, they were gods, part of the pantheon, functional and necessary. For the Hebrews, they were transgressors, fallen angels, causes of evil. The difference lies not in the events, but in the moral evaluation. This would explain why the structure is identical, but the tone is inverted. Prose explains the structural and terminological overlap, allows both texts to be partially accurate, accommodates both literal and allegorical readings. Cons requires acceptance that beings with reproductive capacity crossed with humans, which is a theological problem for monotheists, requires physical evidence that does not exist, and does not resolve the question of the ontological nature of these beings. Each scenario has strength in different areas. Literary dependency is the safest academic explanation, but does not close all textual gaps. Common historical memory is appealing, but overly speculative regarding the original event. Partial identity is intellectually satisfying, but empirically indefensible without more evidence. The choice between them depends on what you prioritize: explanatory parsimony, textual consistency, or openness to anomalies. So the next time you read Genesis 6, or hear about the Anunnaki, or see references to the Nephilim in popular culture, you will know what is behind it. You'll know it is not fantasy invented yesterday. It is a millennia-old discussion with ancient texts, real archaeology, and theological implications that traverse the entire history of religious thought, and you will know that the answer is not closed. It is under continuous investigation. Because the texts say more than we can explain, archaeology reveals more than we expect. And history is always stranger than the simplified version we were taught. If you made it this far and want more investigations connecting ancient text, archaeology, and rival hypotheses without forcing easy conclusions, subscribe now and turn on the bell. This channel exists because there are people willing to think beyond consensus and beyond loose speculation. And the comments are where the best objections arise. So if you disagree with something said here, argue. If you have a source I didn't mention, share. If you have a different interpretation, defend it. This is the space. Were the Nephilim the Anunnaki? Perhaps they are the same memory seen through different eyes. Perhaps they are independent traditions that rhyme by chance. Or perhaps they are fragments of something larger that we still cannot fully reconstruct. What we know is that the question does not die. And as long as ancient texts preserve narratives that defy easy explanation, the investigation continues. Next episode, what the apocryphal texts say about the fate of the Nephilim after the flood, and why this story continues in the canonical Bible without most realizing it.